Kann is a writer and producer at CNN Digital. He covers the climate crisis, the environment, and how people are adapting to climate change. He is going to join us to talk about his work, share some examples of stories that he's done, and offer his best advice. Drew, thank you so much for joining us. So tell us about your work and your role at CNN.
Sure. Well, first thing I would like to say is go dogs. I'm a UGA alum. I graduated in 2010, so it's an honor to get to speak to students, at the university I went to school at, and tell them a little bit about what I do.
We're
So
very
as far
glad
as
to have you.
thank you. So yeah, as far as my current job, I'm a digital producer at CNN. I've been at CNN now for about 7 years. And I have done several different things. I started as a video journalist, which is you're essentially working on the TV side of things, working in studios with the anchors, running scripts and such. It's it frankly doesn't have a ton to do with journalism, but it's a good place to start, and you have a lot of time to shadow people who have interesting jobs and learn kind of which direction you want to take your career. So I did that for a little while, and then I moved into an associate producer role where I was basically rotating through different business units about every 6 or 9 months, and got a lot of good experience. Got to work with our digital video team, editing and producing video for the website. Got to work with our international sports team, and got some experience in live, which was cool and not something that I had studied in school or knew too much about, but it was great experience to get that the taste of that. And then in I guess it was 2016 ish, I moved over to digital full time as a associate producer, and was promoted to producer about a little over 2 years ago now. And my focus right now is mostly on environmental and climate reporting. I've been focused on that for a couple of years now, and yeah, it's one of my passions. I think it's you know, in my opinion, it's the biggest issue that we face, and I don't see it in my time here has gotten a lot better with covering the issue. We still have some work to do, as do all media organizations, but I think we're finally recognizing how serious of a threat it is to pretty much everything that we rely on in our daily lives.
And what is your biggest challenge? You are tackling, as you mentioned, one of the biggest, most pressing, urgent, and complex issues of our time.
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time talking to scientists and reading scientific reports, and there's a lot of important information in those reports, but it can be a challenge to kind of distill it into something that laymen, our readers, can understand, and in a way that they can, even if they don't read the entire article, can figure out what the most important part of the story is and why it matters to them and how it could potentially affect their lives either now or in the future. So that's something that I think I spend a lot of time doing. Sometimes it may seem a bit crazy to if someone sees me doing it, but I like sort of like read the story to myself as I'm writing it and make sure it sounds in a way that or I'll read it to my wife even, and if it doesn't sound the same way that I would tell her the same story, then I think I have some work to do on making it more conversational and relatable. So that's a big challenge and something that I grapple with on a daily basis.
I do the same thing. And in the newsroom, I was known, I just read out my scripts, and people knew I wasn't crazy, I wasn't talking to myself. But I find it to be very helpful. It really helped me with writing. Um, I wanted to also ask you, before we go to, you selected some great examples of work. I wanted to ask you about CNN's approach to this huge issue. I noticed that the name of it is Climate, and there's a plus. So, what is the CNN approach to this very complex issue, which is tied to basically almost everything in our daily lives?
We've recently officially launched a climate team with, I believe it's 5 dedicated journalists and lots of others around the organization who cover topics related to climate. But we have a team now that's focused solely on covering this issue. So I think that just shows like a renewed commitment and a recognition of how serious and important the topic is. But I think you touched on it in your question. Really, I think one of the biggest things that we must do as climate journalists, and that we have done some of and are trying to do a better job of, is when we have these extreme events that occur, like say the heat waves that have been occurring in the West, or the terrible drought that is forcing farmers to choose whether they plant crops or not, and such like that. To not just assume that people understand how that is related to climate change, and to be really explicit about explaining the scientific connections between what people are experiencing and going through in their lives, and what we know about global warming. So yeah, I think just kind of that dot connecting is really critical, especially for um, digital journalists like myself.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I would suggest now that I can share my screen, and I've pulled up all these wonderful stories that you've selected for us. And the first one on your list is the one about the Colorado River in this mega drought situation in the Southwest, and how it's impacting not just the river, but the people whose lives and livelihoods depend on it.
I started paying close attention to it really last year. There's a website called the U.S. Drought Monitor that puts out these weekly updates that show the extent of drought and the severity of drought across the U.S. And I'd always sort of looked at it, but I started looking at it each week last year, and was noticing some pretty alarming trends when everyone was rightly so paying attention to the pandemic. We had a pretty serious drought unfolding across the US, but it's not really, the story is not really, as I found in later reporting, it's not really just about one bad year of drought. This is something that's really been going on for over 20 years now in the Southwest, especially over the Colorado River Basin. So with some more research and talking to sources, we really wanted to figure out, okay, like who is most affected. Lots of people told us, the Colorado River system is the big one. 40 million people rely on it for their water supply. It irrigates something like 5 million acres of farmland. It's some of the most important farmland, not just in the country, in the world. Um, and so they were like, I think you should pay attention to what is happening to the Colorado River. So we started looking into it, and um, what's happening is pretty alarming. And what we tried to do is figure out like who is going to be. It's sort of a slow motion, a disaster unfolding in slow motion. But we wanted to figure out who is going to be impacted first by some of these cutbacks that are looming, and basically because of the complex system of water rights that they use in the U.S. It's a group of farmers in central Arizona, south of Phoenix, and north of Tucson that stand to lose water first when the cutbacks go into effect next year. And so we actually went out to Arizona earlier this year to speak with some of them about how they're preparing. It's going to be a pretty major blow to them. They're losing essentially all of their surface water supply, and are going to have to go back to pumping groundwater, which is what they did before the Colorado River water was made available to them.
Like with this specific story, um, you are considering and analyzing different solutions for a big problem that Florida is facing because of sea level rise. And tell us a little bit how you came up with that idea and that kind of approach.
The initial idea for this story, I happened to read this article in a local newspaper out of Del Rey that was talking about how the city had commissioned a study to look at basically how much it would cost to improve their resiliency to sea level rise, because they've been dealing with something called sunny day flooding that have become more and more damaging in recent years, and swamping people's front yards, getting in their house, that people have water bubbling up through their showers and such like that. It's not really life threatening, but it's costly and a nuisance. And this one city, it's a very affluent city. Del Rey is found that to protect their 60,000 residents, it was going to cost something like $300 million, I think, is the figure in the story to adapt, which is a pretty massive price tag for a place like that to deal with. For a place like Miami or Miami Beach with a huge tax base, they may be able to afford something like that, but it's a different story for these smaller towns.
Yeah, so you find this story, and then how do you find Mr. Kesterin? And you also interview the mayor here. Tell us a little bit about the backstory of how you were able to produce this story.
Yeah, a lot of it was honestly a bit of like Facebook, you can call it stalking or sleuthing, but solutions to this. And so I, started going to some of those pages and looking at the people who were commenting and who seemed to be engaged on the issue, and reached out to some of them to find people who were, both concerned and in this case had been impacted themselves by the issue. And yeah, we talked to there, no shortage of experts on the science behind sea level rise in South Florida. So we talked to researchers at I believe it was USF and University of Miami about really what this part of the country is going to be facing in the years to come.
Yeah, and it's an interesting example of character-driven storytelling, where you're actually we see the person he is impacted, and how we imagine how his lawn is getting flooded, and that's a great technique to distill these very complex stories. And what about the visuals? Did you go with a photographer or?
Yeah, I actually went with two photojournalists from our digital video team, and we actually shot a few stories down there, but this was one of them that came out of our time. We had a drone that we flew over some of the canals, and we did a lot of on-camera interviews with experts and with some of the residents of Del Rey who have been affected by this.
Let's move to another story. Um, this story I would describe as a whodunit. It's very interesting how after many years salmon dying mysteriously off the west coast, they finally discovered what was causing it. And it's also, I would think, a sort of a solutions story as to how they finally found the reason, so they can do something about it. Tell us how you found this story, how you were able to find sources and interview them. Yeah, so the I guess the genesis of the story isn't as exciting as some of the other ones. We get press releases all the time from a lot of these major scientific journals, and this was one of them, and it caught my eye that they had found, and that didn't just come across in the press release that we received. And reading the scientific study is just like how long this has been going on and how hard so many scientists have worked to try and figure out why this is happening, and sort of like the complicated process of elimination that they went through to figure out this one specific chemical that's in pretty much the tire on every car that any of us drive. It's pretty ubiquitous is what is causing this. So I tried to really walk people through that process, how they kind of, as you said, solved this whodunit and isolated this one chemical. And in one way, it's I think it's optimistic because they have figured out why this is happening. On the other hand, it's still going to be very difficult to solve because to this day the chemical is still in
tires that all of us drive, and that there's new ones being sold every day. So that they're exploring alternative chemicals, without uh, you know pressure on them to change how they make their products. This could keep happening. So it is good, yes, that we know what's happening, but putting in place a solution it's going to take some time.
Yeah, any challenges that you came about in trying to produce the story?
Um, I mean, it's just these scientific studies can be pretty complicated, and this one, it's a little, it's not necessarily a climate story. Like I'm pretty comfortable reading scientific reports on, say sea level rise or the connections between hurricanes and climate change, or extreme heat and climate change. But this was, something different and a little outside my comfort zone. So it took a little while to get my head around, all the exactly how they came to the conclusions that they came to, and then also trying to figure out how to present it in a way that is not it's digestible and not jargony, and that anybody can really understand, because um, yeah, that can be tough to do.
Yeah, I noticed that you had interviewed the lead author and the co-author of the studies. So
Mm.
I guess that also helped wrap your brain around the science.
Yes, definitely. I always like to talk to, whenever possible, at least two or three scientists who have been either involved with the study or have worked on other research related to it.
So this is sort of a fun way of dealing with climate change, and it's a very, very different approach. It's a quiz. Tell us about this story and why you wanted to share it with us.
Yeah, so I like exploring like alternative storytelling formats, and I think this is a good example of that. So I think one of the main questions that people who care about the climate have is, what can I do about it, or what are the biggest things that need to be done to solve the problem? And I think some of us know, some of the obvious solutions, which is, use less get our electricity from cleaner sources, from renewables, switch to electric vehicles, eat less meat. Most people are aware that those are things that are contributing to climate change, and doing less of them would help solve the problem. But I hadn't really seen like a good um, journalism based way to explain kind of the bang for your buck that each of these solutions brings, like how much of a dent in the problem, say, wasting less food would make, or eating a plant-rich diet would make. Like, how do those two solutions compare in terms of their potential impact? And so that is kind of what we tried to accomplish with this. And so basically, people can drag these cards and rank them in the order that they think, which solution they think would be the most impactful versus the least impactful, and then they click "How did I do?" and it shows them, okay, here's actually how if everyone did this, here's how big of a dent it could put in our carbon emissions.
And so what was your role? I assume it was a whole team working on this.
Yeah, so I was, I guess, like the lead producer and writer. So I kind of like came up with the concept and worked with this nonprofit called Project Drawdown, who all of their research centers around climate solutions and exploring them and explaining, kind of like identifying pathways to net zero, essentially. And so I worked with them closely on this, on the back end data that feeds the interactive. But then, I worked with our visual news team to produce the quiz, and they're the ones who handle the technical part and the coding and all of that, to make it a really nice user experience.
So this one was tied to a news peg from last year, that it was a record year for hurricanes. and it's a different approach. So was that what spurred you to do the story, that news of 2020? Was it?
Yeah, so we had actually talked about doing the story for quite a while, and it's one of those ones that we had just kind of never found the time to do because there had been so many hurricanes and disasters to cover, but we finally got it done. But I think the main idea behind this was some of the providing a kind of like evergreen resource that is a strong dot connector between a disaster that we're dealing with, on a yearly basis. Every year there's these hurricanes that seem to get more and more damaging every year, and we're writing about the connections to climate change, but we had never really put together like a full fully broken down in depth, like everything we know about how climate change is affecting hurricanes. And that's, kind of what we tried to accomplish with this piece. And it's one that we can, update as new science becomes available, that explains new connections and kind of expands what we know about how climate change is affecting hurricanes. And we can, bring it back whenever these storms come up in the news, as they will and already are this year.
I noticed something very important here, that it was an in-depth look at very transparent also look at what scientists know sort of for sure, what they have yet to discover, with all the myths and all the misinformation going around. Was that something at the back of your mind and your co-authors' minds as you did this story, to make sure that people trusted what you were telling them?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And you can see like basically how we have this organized. We really wanted to be clear for people, clear to our readers that, we don't know everything there is to know about how hurricanes are being impacted, but there are a lot of things that we do know. And so we sort of presented it in that fashion. Here are the things that scientists are almost certain or are certain are being enhanced by climate change. Here are things that they think may be happening, and here are things that scientists want to or need to explore further.
Finally, I want to ask you about your best advice.
For young journalists, or for
that someone gave you, for young journalists, for people like me. This is I can never stop learning. So
sure. Yeah, so I will actually give a piece of advice that I was given by, one of my favorite professors at UGA, who was the late Conrad Fink. I don't know if you worked with him, or the students probably aren't familiar with him, but he was a terrific professor at Grady for years and years. And one of the things that he tried to drive home in his classes was the point that, you are not an expert on everything, but you are an expert on something. And to kind of like keep that in the back of your mind in your reporting process, and to kind of let it guide who you talk to for certain stories, if that makes sense. And to really figure out who is going to be the best person to go to for certain questions, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Not to be intimidated and to feel comfortable asking people, and when you don't know enough, even going back.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what would your best advice be for students who are braving this world of climate change? That is a more complex, as we talked right in the beginning, a more complex issue and topic and beat to cover. What would your top advice be on how to find sources, how to simplify, distill things you have struggled with at CNN and have come up with some workarounds or solutions?
Mm-hmm. So I think one thing that I struggle with is, and I think we all people who cover climate struggle with a bit, is being optimistic and not portraying what is happening is kind of like a foregone conclusion, and doing more to highlight the solutions, because the reality is like, yes, things are bad and are projected to get worse, but what humans are doing now and in the years to come will have a big impact on what the coming years look like. And so I always try to make a point to get that across in my stories. It's just like, we humans are the ones who are responsible for creating the situation, but in a lot of ways, we also control a lot of the solutions. It's just, the political will to put them into practice can be is the main challenge. So that's something I try to remind myself and try to get across in my stories.
And what a great way to end our interview on this uplifting note. Drew, thank you so much for all your great advice and sharing this great work that you have done. I really appreciate it on behalf of my students, and I wish you lots of success. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks so much, Relitza. I appreciate it.